Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have this opportunity to um, revisit history and to hopefully create new history. We have with us this morning Carlyn Nuyda. Am I saying your last name correctly?
Very, very close. Nuyda.
Nuyda.
Nuyda,
Very
yes.
good. Nuyda. And Dr. Kenneth Morris, Morris Jr. Carlyn is the author of LIZZY. Um, and I apologize for forgetting the entire
Oh,
title.
it's okay. Lizzie is
It's
fine. Lizzie, the Elizabeth Keckley story.
the Elizabeth Keckley story. And Elizabeth Keckley was also instrumental in the sewing and domestic science here at Wilberforce University. So it's wonderful to have someone who has an attachment to her to present to us today about her book and about Lizzie's life. And additionally, we have Dr. Kenneth Morris, who is Morris Jr., who is with us, and he is the great, great, great grandson of Frederick Douglass, Father Frederick, as my friend Shamika calls him. And he is also the great great grandson of Booker T. Washington. So this is okay. So I always call myself a bit of a nerd. I just love history and the opportunity to connect history with our present life. So this is quite an exciting event. Thank you both for joining us. If you both would just take a few minutes to talk about yourselves, talk about your endeavors, and introduce yourselves to everyone that's here. We'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Should I begin?
Go
Sure.
ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my name is Carlene. Carmen Evelyn Nuyda is my full name, and I am based out of Los Angeles. 14 years ago, I opened a bridal shop, and I'm a self-taught dressmaker. And it was really driven by the purpose of, you know, reconstructing my career in a way that would allow me to raise my children. So they were shop babies. And during the second or third year of my business as an entrepreneur, a bride came into my shop and requested for me to create a gown that was evocative of the Civil War era. And of course, I was a little bit hesitant to, take on and tackle that responsibility because number one, I wasn't that well versed in that arena of dressmaking as it pertains to fashion. And I also felt that there was a great responsibility to be had in creating and glamorizing an era that was not, something that I, felt positively about. So I approached it with a lot of care and requested the client to be if I could be given a few days to consider it. And in those few days, I did my own research and I was at a dead stop. I everything about it was a no. I didn't want to take the
Mhm.
job because nothing about it was, pleasant in my research. And then, it got to the point where I was about to, call it a day. And then this beautiful dress popped up on the screen. And I thought to myself, that surely cannot be of the era because it's completely different. The silhouette is different. The entire style of it, the fashion of it was just not consistent with all the bells and whistles of the Southern style of clothing of the day. And then when I found out that it was a gown that was designed and created by a formerly enslaved woman named Elizabeth Keckley, I became completely, enthralled. I was so captivated by that, and I was curious to know what the background of this woman was. And in doing so, I, ended up, needless to say, I took the job and created for her a dress that was sort of along the same lines of Elizabeth Keckley's style of dressmaking. And to cut a long story short, it took me on a 14-year, um, journey. I was in communion with Elizabeth Keckley's life, and that I became so intrigued I became so I, curious, and I wanted to, find out more about her story. And long story short, I you did not seek to write a book about her, but when COVID happened, I decided to put all of this information in one file,
Mhm.
and it became a book. And so that's my story. I'm from Los Angeles. I'm a mother of two growing young ladies. And, I spend most of my days, you know, raising my kids and
Mhm.
focusing on, amplifying the story of Elizabeth Keckley beyond the book. So that's
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. We have a question. Do you have a pic that you can share of the dress?
um yes, in fact I do, but I don't have access to it right now. What you could do is go to elizabethkeckley.com. And in one of the pages in the book, I mean, in the website, you will see that famous violet gown. It's actually in the Smithsonian Museum on view there. So it's a beautiful velvet gown with white piping, and the posture is incredible. It really it commands a lot of respect. You can imagine Mrs. Lincoln walking into
Mm.
a dressed that way. So yeah, I don't have a photograph of it on hand. I apologize. I wasn't prepared. Yeah.
Oh, it's okay. Ms. Arnold has linked the website, and
Okay.
so everyone should be able to access it from the chat. So
Great.
thank you, Ms. Arnold. And next, Kenneth, if you will go ahead and give your introduction. Thank you.
I would be happy to. And thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this fireside chat. It is quite an honor to be connected again with Wilberforce University. And I have quite a history already with Wilberforce. And I'd like to say that one of my colleagues who runs a program called Footsteps to Freedom that we partner with, it's an Underground Railroad study tour that we've been doing for more than 20 years. We go to Wilberforce every summer, 4 times, with almost 400 educators, administrators, and some parents every summer. And I see Mr. Hardy Brown II on. He is an alum of Wilberforce. He also was a former administrator, and I consider him the greatest Wilberforce University ambassador that's out there. So if any of you don't know Hardy, please reach out to him, footstepstofreedom.com. He's a great resource for helping with job placement and internship and that sort of thing. And he and I are based in California. So had to recognize my colleague and brother. So Hardy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So I am, as you heard, the great 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 grandson of Frederick Douglass and also the great great grandson of Booker T. Washington. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel like I'm far removed. And
Mm.
you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglas and to Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But
Mhm.
many people know a grandparent, and some of you listening and watching to this may have known a great grandparent. And
Yeah.
that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors. You see, because my great grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 101 years old.
Wow.
And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. Now, she didn't know she was going to grow up and
Mhm.
marry his grandson, Joseph, but that's what happened. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, lived to be 94, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting at the knee of my great grandmother, Fanny Douglass, as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him the man with the great big white hair. And I would sit at the knee of my Aunt Portia, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And I'm president and co-founder of our family organization, which is called Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. And we spend a lot of time in K through 12 schools talking about the history of slavery in this country, talking about the great freedom fighters that came before us, talking about the Underground Railroad and freedom seekers trying to get to their freedom in Canada. And whenever I introduce myself with all of those greats, students are always kind of look at me cross-eyed, like you're so far removed. And so I try to put it within context that the generations are not that far removed. And I had this profound thought when we started doing this work that hands that touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touch mine. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from each man. I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country when you consider the generations. And so I was born in Washington, D.C. I spent all of my summers at Frederick Douglass's summer beach house on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, looking back across the water to the land on the other side, because that land is the eastern shore of Maryland, where he had been born into slavery with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And there were images of my ancestors everywhere. And I'm sure as we get into the Q&A portion of our chat here this afternoon, I can dive deeper into, some of these things. But there was never a time when someone sat me down and said, we've got something really important to tell you about your ancestry. I've just always have known. My images of my ancestors have been all around. And so it really took me many, many years. I was well into my 30s before I started to connect to this ancestry, this incredible heritage and lineage that I carry. And that was for many reasons. I took it for granted. I'd seen what the pressure had done to those that came before me. And my parents, grandparents, great grandmothers wanted to kind of put up this hedge of protection around me to shield me from these very formidable legacies. So it took me a while to be able to step into my own shoes. But because I did find the mission eventually on my own, I think it's more meaningful than it would have been had it been forced on me. And so, again, I am proud now to
Mm-hmm.
be the co-founder and president of Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. We're an abolitionist and anti-racist organization with the mission to build strong children and to end systems of exploitation and oppression. And again, I thank you for inviting me to be a part of this important fireside chat. And I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Um, that was inspiring, and it's only the introduction. So I'm excited to see where we go here.
He's
Um,
definitely he's definitely Frederick Douglass's great grandson.
absolutely has that oratory now.
That oratorical gene.
I learned
Absolutely.
that from Mr. Hardy Brown.
Ah, duly noted. Duly noted. Well, so we'll go ahead and begin with the question section of the Zoom. And this will be just for Carlene and Kenneth. There will be an opportunity after they have finished for those who are still with us for this, for the participants who are still with us to offer their own questions. So for right now, I'd like for everyone to listen to their answers and, let them settle in you. And then you will have an opportunity to pose your questions. So, Carlene, if you don't mind, we'll start with you first.
Okay, sure.
Okay, great. Um, what do you believe was the most revealing part about Lizzie that drew you closer to her?
Wow, that's a very sprawling answer. I think the most revealing aspect about Elizabeth Keckley's life that drew me closer to her was her unbreakable spirit.
Mm,
Her unbreakable spirit and her ability to navigate her life in the trajectory of self-made success. She endured the unimaginable, the unspeakable. Having born into slavery, she was subjected to the most cruel conditions. And for 30 years, yet she refused to let those circumstances, define her. What truly moved me about her was that she had the ability to reclaim her agency. She purchased her
mhm,
freedom along with her sons, which was a feat
mhm,
in and of itself. She was able to establish herself as a self-made entrepreneur in Washington, D.C. And not only did she establish herself as an entrepreneur, she became the most sought after dressmaker in the nation. Um, Sometimes her waiting list would be up to 3 years. Add to this the fact that she used her talent to break those barriers, and she was courageous about it. The fact that she was really committed to being of use to her people. She could have stopped there. She could have just been a free woman, enjoying the fruits of her labor, if you will, as a free woman, and being the most sought after dressmaker of the day. But she went beyond that. She formed the Contraband Relief Association, which is an organization designed to provide all the necessary support and resources, by way of food, shelter, medical care, education, job training, job placement, clothing, to all recently freed slaves. And this was something that, was not an easy thing to put together. And she was able to get the support of President Abraham Lincoln, Mrs. Lincoln. The War Department was heavily involved. She actually had Stanton as telling Stanton what to do. She got the support from abolitionist organizations far and wide, from churches all over the nation. And of course, Frederick Douglass was one of her biggest supporters. I mean, he wrote her some checks. So aside from that, she also went, that grew branches, by the way, in various parts of the country. And on top of that, I think, she didn't stop there. She built another organization called the National Association for the Destitute, Colored Women and Children, which was also aimed to provide the same kind of support for Black women and their children to get a head start in life. And many can argue that it is the blueprint of what we know today as a welfare system, because before then there was no such thing. So that's a whole another lecture that we could get into. But she was resilient, she was talented, she had the ability to navigate, amongst the highest and the lowest, tiers of society, if you will. So it made her story to me very deeply important and deeply personal, because as a woman of color myself, I think, her story is very inspiring. She's a woman who remained true to her identity. She was a proud Black woman. And I think at the end of the day, that is what, inspired me the most.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carlene. Kenneth, your question is, how has your family's history with Frederick Douglass shaped your sense of identity or your views on race and social justice?
Yeah, wonderful question. So you might think that, growing up in the family of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, that you would be connected to this legacy and that it would just be in you. And as I mentioned in my introduction, that it wasn't something that I always embraced.
Mhm.
And so, as a young kid, I certainly started to understand their importance from a very young age when I started to notice that they were on money, and there were statues of them, and they were on postage stamps, and schools were named for them and bridges were named for them. And as a little boy, I would go out to dedications of these various places and spaces that were being named in their honor. So I understood that. And when I would ask my classmates if their grandparents were on statues, just because I thought maybe everybody's grandparents were, what the answer would be that I would get. And, just growing up in that environment and really starting to feel kind of the weight of expectation that there's greatness that's flowing through my veins, and that I have the DNA of this country's most important and influential heroes. But I took it for granted for most of my life. I really ran away from it. And I was happy to be, or am happy to be, a husband of two beautiful daughters. I've been married now for 40 years. I own my own advertising and marketing company for almost 20 years, which catered to the travel industry. It was a very successful endeavor. So I'm good. Don't talk to me about this Frederick Douglass stuff, this Booker T. Washington stuff. And I had friends that I went to high school with and college with that didn't even know of my relationship because I never talked about it. But in 2005, I read a National Geographic magazine, and the cover story was 21st Century Slaves. And it was an article about human trafficking existing all over the world, including right here in the United States. And at that time, I had thought about trafficking as something that happened in far off places and didn't make the connection to home. And that article really just struck me. And I wanted to learn more and more about the issue. And so I was just kind of researching and trying to read everything I could get my hands on. And then one night when I was sitting in my living room, this night changed the whole trajectory of my career and everything that I'm doing right now. And I was reading another article about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service countless men almost every single evening. And down the hallway, I could hear my daughters getting ready for bed. And my older daughter at the time was 12. And so she was the same age as the girl that I was reading about in the brothels. And then my younger daughter was 9. And my daughters were laughing and playing, and they were about to get down on their knees to say their prayers and to get tucked safely into bed. And then my mind just starts racing, and I can't wrap my brain around what I'm reading and what I'm hearing down the hallway. And I remember thinking to myself, that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is getting tucked safely into bed, not being forced into bed to service some sick individual. And when I went in to say goodnight to my girls, I had this moment where I couldn't even look them in the eyes. And I couldn't look them in the eyes and walk away and not do something about this. And it was almost immediately that everything just started welling up inside of me. And I understood that I did have this platform that I had really kind of wasted. It was a platform that was built through struggle and through sacrifice. And perhaps I could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to do something about this issue. And so on one side, had Frederick Douglass and the legacy of him as the great abolitionist, and on the other side, the legacy of Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee Institute, as the great educator. And we could perhaps combine those legacies, abolition into education. And so my mom and I started the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives a couple of years later. And it wasn't really until that time when I really started to dive deeply into my ancestors' stories. And I knew all of the surface stuff. I knew the one paragraph that they taught you in school about my ancestors, but I really didn't know the depth and breadth of their contributions. And so I really became that historian, self-taught historian, and wanted to make sure that I understood and could communicate their importance and their contributions. And while I'm at it, I just want to say really quickly that this story is not just about the men in my family, because there were women that worked alongside of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. My great 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 grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass, is a really important figure in this story. She has been pushed aside by male historians, mostly white male historians, that have not treated her with the dignity and respect that she deserves. She and Frederick were married for 44 years. They had 5 children together. They had 21 grandchildren. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad out of their house in Rochester, New York, where she helped to ferry hundreds of freedom seekers to their freedom after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, which meant you could no longer go from a slave state like Kentucky across the Ohio to a free state like Ohio and be free. You had to go all the way to Canada to be free. And so Anna was instrumental in helping those freedom seekers get there. And so I'm very proud of Frederick Douglass. I'm proud of Booker T. Washington. I'm proud of Olivia Davidson Washington, Booker T. Washington's second wife, and my great great grandmother who helped him build Tuskegee Institute. I'm just as proud of the women in the family as I am of the men. And so the whole collective, the whole radical freedom fighting collective of the Douglass and Washington family has helped to shape who I am today. And I feel like I am probably inching my way out of those long, vast shadows.
Wow.
That yes, absolutely. Wow, that was a great answer, and thank you for highlighting the women in your lineage. Yes, thank you, Carlene. Your next question, um, was Lizzie's relationship with Mary Todd Lincoln well received? Can you please expound on the depth of their relationship?
Okay. Well, Lizzie's relationship with Mary Todd Lincoln was complex,
Mm,
and it was not always well received. You know, as Mary's dressmaker, and she was on a first name basis, by the way, with Mrs. Lincoln,
mm,
in closed doors. She was
mm-hmm,
So, as Mary's dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley was both a trusted employee and a confidant. Um, and after President Lincoln's assassination, in fact, Lizzie was the only person that Mrs. Lincoln wanted at the time of Lincoln's death inside her quarters. Not her children, not the doctor, and not any of the president's aides. Nobody. It was Elizabeth that she sent for, and had her taken to her quarters in the White House shortly after President Lincoln took his last breath. And that is definitely documented. And she was there for Mrs. Lincoln from beginning of their friendship all the way to the end. And when Mrs. Lincoln spiraled into deep, deep, deep grief, Lizzie left her business to help her friend. She had a staff, and she had them take care of the shop, and she left her business to take care of her friend, to help her navigate and sort through the business of the transition from the White House into, just a civilian's life. And at the time, Mrs. Lincoln had amassed an insurmountable amount of debt, of which Elizabeth Keckley volunteered to assist her in paying off. And one of the ways that Elizabeth devised a plan was to, number one, privately sell some of the couture gowns that she created for Mrs. Lincoln. And then she decided to write her memoirs in an effort to raise money to help Mrs. Lincoln pay for her debts confidentially. And she made an agreement with the publisher to have the book published, obviously, but to make sure that none of the private letters would be for public consumption. The publisher agreed to this promise, except that they didn't live up to the promise. So when the book came out, it created an uproar, and it was perceived as Elizabeth being, in betrayal of their friendship. And her character was basically assassinated by the public. And soon her clients that were once very loyal to her, stopped working with her. And it got to the point where Mrs. Lincoln's son, Robert, ordered the publisher to remove all copies that were in circulation. So, that erasure was already happening then. And she actually passed away not knowing whether or not her story would ever be told, because her book was removed from publication. And at the time, there was no internet, there was none of that stuff. There were no photocopy machines. So, it was just left for something that she once did. And after she was canceled, her loyal, like I said, her loyal clients stopped working with her. She lost her business. And then Wilberforce University offered her a position to be the head of the domestic arts. And at that point, she became the teacher, and she taught students the art of couture. And she lived out the rest of her life, dedicated to, teaching others how to create couture fashion, distinctively made clothes. She suffered a stroke and she retired. When she was in Ohio, Mrs. Lincoln was admitted into an insane asylum. And it was Elizabeth at the behest of her son, Robert. And it was Elizabeth Keckley who actually pled her case to a panel of officials. And it was Elizabeth Keckley who, in an ironic twist of fate, facilitated Mary Lincoln's independence. So you can imagine, how life turns Uh, Mary was desperate to be free from the shackles of being institutionalized in an asylum, and it was her one friend, her one reliable friend's word that convinced the panel to release Mary to live out the rest of her life with her sister in Chicago. So, their relationship reflected the fragility of cross-racial friendships during an era where, the systems were broken. And the relationship was deeply personal. It was mutually respectful, but it was also strained by societal expectations. They had to mind their manners, if you will, in public. So I think the way history tells the story of Elizabeth Keckley was that she was, this woman who, exploited Mrs. Lincoln's story and, wanted to, make money off of it. But that was hardly the case. Elizabeth Keckley sought to write the book in an effort to defend her friend from all the rumors and primarily to help her friend from the financial burdens that she was undergoing, which is also in an ironic twist of fate, a former slave and helping once the most powerful woman in the country. So, I think it's interesting that history tries to uh, create a narrative that's false. And that's why it's very important that we're having lectures like this and, important that books are written about her. Because, there's one side of history that is not painting the full picture. And Elizabeth Keckley was canceled in today's terms. She was canceled. And I think, that, you know, the, the day of reckoning has come where this is concerned. And we're here to make an indelible, permanent imprint in history, to correct the wrong, and to make her whole again.
Mhm.
So their friendship was really special, much to much to the disagreement of many white male historians.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you. I have some thoughts that are going through my head, but I'm going to reserve them. But thank you. Thank you very much, Carlene. Um, and so, Kenneth, your next question. Um, Frederick Douglass was a fierce advocate for education, especially noted with his connection to Wilberforce. How do you see his emphasis on learning and intellectual growth reflected in your family's values today?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that question. And I just am floored by what I just heard about Lizzie and her importance with Mary Todd Lincoln and her what I would call freedom from the asylum. So, thank you for sharing that. And it's an honor to be here with you and to have this
Feeling is
conversation.
mutual.
Yes, you heard that Lizzie was connected to Wilberforce, and Frederick, as you just mentioned, was connected to Wilberforce as a trustee in
Hmm.
1867. He was a friend of Daniel Payne, and so there's a rich legacy of education that continues all the way back to just shortly after the Civil War. When we talk to young people about the importance of education and knowing where you come from, the importance of history, and this idea that history flows through all of our veins. I always like to start with a story about Frederick Douglass while he was enslaved, as I mentioned, with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey on the eastern shore of Maryland. When he was about 8 or 9 years old, he was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation to go to Baltimore City to be the house servant for his enslaver's family. And the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wasn't able to learn to read and write because we know from our US history that it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. But now he was going to be in the big city. He would be around free Black children. He would be around poor white children. But what happened most importantly when he got there was his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, didn't know that it was illegal to teach him. And she had a young son, Tommy, that she was teaching. And alongside Tommy was his playmate, Fred, who was bright-eyed and eager to learn. And there is a important nuanced point that is missing from the story and how it's told. The way that the story is told is that out of the kindness of her Christian heart, she began to teach young Frederick his ABCs, which is true. But the important point that isn't always touched upon is that he asked her to teach him. And I say that because I consider that that was his first moment of self-liberation, was to understand that education was going to be his key to freedom. And so she began to teach him his ABCs, and that was all he needed, was that little spark of light into his mental bondage. And the lessons would continue for a while until his enslaver, Hugh Auld, found out what was happening. And when he found out, he got angry. And he looked at his wife and he looked at young Frederick and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave. He'll be running away from himself." And I hope everybody that's watching and listening to this got that message. It will unfit him to be a slave. And Fred looked at his master and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that education equals freedom. Education equals emancipation. Education equals liberation. And he would teach himself to read and write. And so fast forward to the work that we do around human trafficking prevention education, when I started thinking about what we can do and how we could address human trafficking today, I went directly to that story, which became the foundation of the work that we do. How can we unfit communities to allow slavery to exist and thrive today? And it's through education. And so education is a theme, a thread that runs throughout the Douglass family, and it certainly runs throughout the Booker T. Washington family. And as I mentioned, Booker T. Washington being the founder of Tuskegee Institute at the age of 25 years old in 1881, another HBCU, another brilliant, beautiful, magnificent HBCU down in Tuskegee, Alabama. And so education is important, as we all know. The narratives of telling our own stories. We are seeing right now an effort, a concerted effort to whitewash history, which is nothing new in American history. This has happened before, but the banning of books and trying to erase our stories. So for those of you that are interested in history, that are interested in writing and language and words, it's really important that we not only research and uncover these stories, but make sure that we're telling them so that we can help control our own narrative and not let somebody else do that for us. And right there in Wilberforce, there is incredible history of not only of the school, but of the Underground Railroad, and great men and women, the greatest freedom fighters that in this country, all for the most part went through Wilberforce. So you all have tremendous history there, and I hope that at least this presentation that we're doing this afternoon will inspire you to want to learn more about your own history in your own area. So again, back to the original question, education is the key to freedom. And that's as true today as it was all those years ago. And I'll just tell you a really quick story. When we started our work, I was in a barbershop in Albany, New York, and I was talking to a group of teenage African-American men, young men. And I told the story about Frederick Douglass's enslaver getting upset. And then I also told the story that he wrote about in his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which was first published in 1845. And in that, he wrote, "I was always so hungry as a slave child. I always had this pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when I would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a trough similar to what pigs eat out of. And all of the children, including Frederick, would crawl on their hands and knees to try to eat what little food was in there, to eat like pigs, to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He did not own himself. Someone else owned him." And so if you think about this little boy, that when he began to teach himself to read and write, one of the ways that he did that was he traded bread for reading lessons. He traded food, something of such great importance to him. And so when I told that story, first, one of the young men in the barbershop said, "So what you're telling me, Dr. Morris, is he would rather feed his mind and have his stomach go empty."
Mm.
And then one of the other young men said to me, You know, if I could describe to you what's happening in my mind, it's like a pitch black hallway. There are no windows, no doors, no way out. I cannot figure out which way to point, and I feel hopeless. But what you just told me about Frederick Douglass and his desire for literacy and learning to read and write, you've just now shown a little bit of light into my mental darkness. And now I know which direction to point in. Now I know I have some hope that I can get out of this. So this message of legacy and history and literacy and education is just as important today for freeing us from our mental bondage and breaking the chains of our darkness, so that we can think critically, begin to think critically around us in the world in which we live.
That was, as Shamika said, powerful. Very much so. Powerful. Thank you. Thank you very much. I, not to make this about me, but I am so grateful to be at Wilberforce because of history, because of seeing these young people here not give up, consistently going after their degrees, regardless to what may step in front of them to prevent them. They keep going. And the faculty and staff here that are assisting them to keep going. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kenneth. Um, Carlene, I've got a question about being an author. And so, as authors research for their books, there's this toil and labor in the production of the book. So, what encouragement would you give any budding authors?
Okay, before I get to that, I have to say
Sure.
that 40 years ago when I immigrated to the United States of America, I was 14 years old, giving away my age. I was 14 years old and for the first time in a public school system. And I got myself a little library card at the Los Angeles Public Library. And my parents said, okay, pick your books, you know. And I didn't know where to begin, but there this book was. And it was the first book that Frederick Douglass ever wrote. And I was captivated. I had no idea who he was. I was just simply looking at the book. Ken knows this story too many times. Simply looking at the book and saying to myself, wow, gee, that's a good looking man, you know, at 14 years old. I said, wow, he's very, very interesting looking, you know, very, I wonder, I would like to take this book, borrow this book. And the lady at the library said, I think that is not good for your age. And I said, is there a requirement for me to, you know, have my parents maybe, you know, borrow it on my behalf? So anyway, long story short, I took the book home and I read it from start to finish, I believe that same day. And it was everything I needed to know about anything. It was everything I needed to know about anything. It was everything I needed to know about American history. It was everything I needed to know about myself. It was everything I needed to know about the systemic, you know, oppression all over the world, including where I came from, the Philippines, the colonization uh, of the Filipino people under the oppressive rule of the Spaniards. It was everything I needed to know. And so going back to what Ken was saying as far as like education, you know, that was my first, that was the first, my inculcation into this journey that I became very much committed to, which was to learn about American history the right way. And, you know, there was always this thing in the back of my head, you know, high school to college, you know, there was always this thing in the back of my head that was always saying Frederick Douglass, because, you know, you're being taught something that is not really consistent to the truth. And there's Frederick Douglass. So I took it all in, but there was always Frederick Douglass in the back of my head. So I think that's really important. And it's even more incredible to me when I think about the fact that I'm sitting in this space with you guys. Because who would have thought that little girl, 14 years old, would be in the same space now sharing the story of Elizabeth Keckley with a great, great, great grandson of Frederick Douglass. So that is just to me I mean, it's mind-boggling. So I just have to say that. Back to your question. Sorry, Ken, I had to share that story. Back to your question, to budding authors, I would say trust the process. Even when it's difficult, because it's gonna be, researching and writing can be isolating, and there will be times when self-doubt creeps in. But remember these stories. Look for these stories, especially the ones that have been overlooked. Excuse me, the ones have been erased. Those are the ones that deserve to be told. Those are the ones that deserve your attention. Those are the ones that deserve the audience. 14 years ago, this book that I wrote on Elizabeth Keckley was 14 years in the making. I didn't set out to write the book. But what happened was this life-changing, transformative, process of learning about the work that this woman put in, and the importance of that work, and how it directly affects me today. It directly affects me as a woman. It directly affects me as a mother. It directly affects me as a businesswoman, as a creative person. It directly affects me, And while I did not, plan to write a book then, I little did I know that the research that I had gathered all these years is what led to the book today. So trust the process. Be patient with your journey is what I would tell authors or people who want to embark on this thing. Embrace your mistakes, embrace the revisions, find a community who believe in your vision, and surround yourself with people like Ken, you know, who are very open and willing to share the knowledge. Know that your work has the power to enlighten others. Know that your desire has the capacity to heal, and inspire others. Elizabeth Keckley's story reminds us that perseverance and truth telling is so important, or that your words can shape history, that your work is important, that you hold space, and that, I would encourage you to just keep writing, even when it feels impossible. Elizabeth Keckley, had a purpose in writing her story. But I think at the end of the day, beyond the practical side of it, which was to help her best friend pay off her debts, I think Elizabeth Keckley knew that this was going to be important for future generations. And in fact, it is, because it is one of the most important, slave narratives, on record today. So, I and it was on the brink of being completely forgotten. But you know what? It resurfaced. And that's a whole other story on how that happened. Elizabeth Keckley's book was taken off of the shelves at the behest of Robert Lincoln. Robert Clinton is my dad. Robert Lincoln. And that was a done deal. Elizabeth Keckley passes away in 1907 from complications of a stroke. And in her understanding, her book was no longer in circulation and would never be. That is what my research led me to understand and conclude. But somewhere in 1865, when Lincoln declared victory over the war, and he wanted to make his presence known on conquered soil in Virginia, he disembarked his barouche. He traveled by boat on the River Queen down the Potomac River, Elizabeth Keckley being the only Black person in the boat. He makes his way to the Black infantrymen to thank them. These infantrymen are very important in history because they were the ones who hijacked and ambushed the wagon that was carrying the supplies, the artillery, the medication, the guns, the gunpowder, all of that. They ambushed it. Meanwhile, The Confederate troops were waiting for it. And they were getting killed left and right because they were left without the supplies. And that's my research leads me to believe that's how the war was won at the end of the day. Lincoln proceeds to disembark the barouche, the horse carriage. Elizabeth Keckley and Mrs. Lincoln are in the barouche because he wants to say thank you to the men, the Black infantrymen. One of the members of that troop was a private named William Crowdy. Young boy, you know, life moves on. 1932 Harlem Renaissance, fast forward. Reverend Stansel conducts his congregation, his Sunday service, and he says, we are, giving praise to our founding father, who once was part of the Black infantrymen that fought in the Civil War, Reverend Crowdy. And he bequeathed that congregation to Reverend Stansel. Reverend Stansel tells the congregation that he was important. He was an important part of history, not only because of his service to the country, but also because there's this book that he saved that he wanted me to keep. And this book tells the story of a formerly enslaved woman named Elizabeth Keckley, a book that was erased and taken off the shelves and no longer in circulation. But it's going to get reprinted. And Stansel revived the book in 1932 in Harlem Renaissance, revived the book. And that's why we have access to it today. So what I say to authors is to keep writing, to tell your story, especially in this day and age when it's really kind of hard to erase that imprint. It's really hard. It's very difficult to erase that imprint. Be courageous, tell the story, be responsible about it, and, tell the stories, especially of the ones that have been overlooked. So, that's how I see it.
Thank you so much, Carlene. Thank you. Yes, thank you. I always want to say more, and then I'm like, you know what? I'll talk forever. So I'm going to I'm going to sanction myself right here. So Kenneth, for your next question, what do you think Frederick Douglass would say if he was alive today? What issues do you think he would be most passionate about addressing? And I have to step away for just a couple of minutes, but I will return. So, Kenneth, if you would please continue with your answer.
Before I jump into that, how are we on time? Do we have a hard stop in the next 4 or 5 minutes?
No, we're still good.
Okay, all right.
Yes, we're still good. Thank you.
So I get this question a lot. What would Frederick Douglass, what would Booker T. Washington think if they were here today? And the question is asked because of the climate in which we find ourselves, where the struggle still continues. It's a mighty struggle that still continues. And the answer to that question is, I don't know what he would say. And I don't think anybody knows what he would say. But I will say, because his blood flows through my veins, I'll take liberty and say that I think that he would be somewhat pleased. He would be pleased that we have made progress while it's been slow and incremental and not as fast as those of us that are very progressive would like to see. He would look to see that we did elect an African-American president. We had a vice president, a woman of color, who came very close to becoming president of the United States. He would be pleased with that progress, I believe. But I also think that he would be outraged that there's still so much work that needs to be done. And, Frederick Douglass has a lot of great quotes. One of them that I always draw back to or come back to is, without struggle, there is no progress. And what that infers is that we need to have struggle to continue to progress. And one of the things, and I'll bring up my good friend Hardy Brown again, because this is something that he said several years ago that I mention a lot when I give speeches. And in the time that we find ourselves, which side of history are we going to be on? Are we going to be on the right side of history or on the wrong side of history? Thank goodness my ancestors, Elizabeth, Keckley, and many others were on the right side of history. But Hardy said one day that really struck a tone with me. He said, what will our great, great, great grandchildren say about us 150 years from now in this moment in time? When they look back at this history, this craziness that's going on, not only were we on the right side of history, but what did we do to advance freedom? Because freedom's torch, liberty's torch, has been passed on to all of us. And we have an obligation. And you might say, well, Dr. Morris, you have an obligation to carry your history forward because of the two people that you're related to. But each and every one of us descends from somebody that made a difference. I guarantee it. And we all stand on the shoulders and walk in the shoes of those that came before us. And for those of you that have researched your family tree, I'm sure you found great heroes and heroines that you're proud of that may have given up their lives just for the freedoms that we do have today, may have given up their lives just so that we can come together in an integrated classroom and have a conversation. And so we all have greatness flowing through our veins. And how do we carry our history forward? Because history lives in each of us. I remember, again, when we started our work, I had a 10-year-old girl who was sitting in the classroom and I was giving my presentation and she was so excited to share something with me and she was bouncing up and down in her chair and raising her hand. And I called on her and she said, Mr. Morris, I want you to know that I researched my family tree and I found that my great, 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 four greats grandmother was born into slavery, taught herself to read and write in secret, and then she ran away and became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist. And she knew what that word meant, and she was very proud to share it with me. And so she's just, again, just like so pent up. And she said, so Mr. Morris, do you know what all of this means? And before I had a chance to even respond, she said, it means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do. And yes, we all have greatness flowing through our veins. We all stand on the shoulders and walk in the shoes of those that came before us. And so, yes, I have an obligation to carry my history forward, but you also have an obligation to carry your history forward. And for those of you that have children or decide to have children and you have great, great, great grandchildren, what's going to happen when that descendant of yours wants to know about their great, great, great grandmother, grandfather, and that history has not been passed down? And so it's important for all of us, it's incumbent for all of us to not only research our family history, and I understand all of the challenges that come from trying to find records for those of us that descend from enslaved Africans that were oppressed and enslaved for more than 400 years. There are lots of challenges that are there, but there has been a lot of progress that's been made with records and things that have been found in basements and attics, libraries that have been digitized. And all you really need to do if you're having any trouble researching your family ancestry is just to find one little thread that you can pull on. And once you pull on that thread, there's a lot that will open up about your own story. So I encourage all of you that haven't looked into your own family tree to start to think about that. And those of you that are young enough that have maybe grandparents still living or great grandparents still living, ask them, go to them and ask them questions about your family. And today, students have the greatest technology known to man in the palm of your hands. And so you can use that technology to be able to record these stories, either audio or video. And so, yes, let me just say one thing, because I see a comment in the chat about Frederick Douglass being a photographed person. He was the most photographed American of the 19th century. And while I'm talking about technology, this is a great segue. He was photographed more than President Lincoln, more than Ulysses S. Grant, more than General Custer, and his only contemporaries in the world that were photographed more than he was the British royal family. And the reason that he was photographed so many times, and there are at least 168 known photographs of him, which may not sound a lot to those of us today that can take 168 pictures in one day with your phone, but back then it was really a chore to sit down and get a picture taken. But he understood from a very young age, really at the age of 22, only 2 years removed from slavery, that this new technology, photography, that he become of age with, he could utilize to make his arguments for liberation and equality, in addition to his oratory and his writings. And he knew that there were racist caricatures out there that showed people of African descent as less than human, sometimes with exaggerated features, with tails. And so he's trying to place into the public consciousness the notion that people of African descent are worthy of freedom, worthy of citizenship. And he said, when you look at a photograph of me and you look in my eyes, you're going to see my humanity, and you're never going to deny that I am worthy of that freedom and worthy of citizenship. And he also was trying to counteract the notion in the public consciousness of people that were pro-slavery and the federal government that were saying they're better off in slavery. They're getting some measured level of care. Listen to the happy songs that they're singing, making a group of people an other to justify taking away their freedom, their liberty, their dignity. And so he's placing himself right in the middle of that. And he said, when you look at a picture of me, you're never going to see a happy, amiable fugitive slave. And that's why when you think about these younger photographs, you see him looking directly into the camera with that steely glare and that fiery gaze. And so I just wanted to just hop on that a second, because I saw somebody that made it put into the chat that he was the most photographed American of the 19th century.
He revolutionized, photography in that sense. He was like the first Instagram, if you will.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. There's a great video. It's called Frederick Douglass, Father of the Selfie. And it's about a 7-minute video that I know a lot of teachers that we interact with on our Footsteps to Freedom trip love to use that in the classroom. So check that out. It kind of brings that history that I just talked about to present day.
Amazing.
That is amazing. Frederick Douglass, Father of the Selfie. I love it.
Yeah.
And yes, Shamika, he was an agitator and a disruptor.
Mm-hmm. Agitate.
How perfect. How perfect. One question left for each of you, and then we will open up to questions in the chat. So, Carlyn, your last question is, what is Lizzie's greatest legacy? And how can we intersect that into our lives today?
Woo. Elizabeth Keckley, born in 1818, died in 1907. America's first, on record, haute couturier. Anna Winter, I'm ready for you.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? History says that the first American couturier was Charles James. Charles James was born in 1908. Elizabeth died in 1907. We can just do the math. The arithmetic is simple. So we can honor her legacy in so many ways. We can embrace the fact that she was a woman who was self-sufficient, who believed in self-sufficiency. We can honor her legacy by uplifting marginalized voices, ensuring that the untold stories are told, especially those of Black women. Anna Murray Douglass was one of them. Okay. Telling the stories of Black women, giving them the recognition that they deserve, whether through business, through the arts, through activism, mentorship, philanthropy. We can all follow their spirit, her spirit of perseverance and purpose. She reminds us that all Black women's narratives matter, all, that they shaped history, that their voices deserve to be heard and amplified and celebrated. Today we still see the disparities. We still see the disparities in the economic opportunities, the wage gaps, access to resources, especially for women of color. We see that today. And Keckley's story is a reminder of that economic independence is a form of power, that education is a form of liberation. And how we can honor that is by supporting Black-owned businesses, particularly those led by Black women. It's a very crucial part in advancing equality. I think when it comes to women's empowerment, Keckley's legacy shows the importance of mentorship. I'm being mentored by Ken. The importance of education, the importance of community support. She just didn't succeed on her own, and she just didn't succeed for herself. Elizabeth uplifted others. She served her community. She lived a life of purpose, whether it was by training 20 Black women in her under her employ, the art of dressmaking, advocating for formerly enslaved people, using her platform to tell the untold stories of her time, including Mary Lincoln's story. Her journey teaches us that true empowerment is not just about our personal success. It's not just about creating it's not just about us. It's creating opportunities for others to rise as well, knowing that we are all in this together, where the success of one is the success of all. In today's conversations about race and gender, Elizabeth Keckley's life is a powerful example of that resilience, her self-determination, the impact of what storytelling can do to the authors, to the researchers that are thinking about embarking on this journey of, talking about somebody's story. Do it. Her experiences remind us that Black women and their contributions have to be acknowledged. They have to be preserved. They have to be stewarded. They have to be protected. They have to be celebrated. Not just in the books, not just in lectures like this, not just in classrooms, in our daily lives, in our conversations about progress and equity at the dinner table, at home. Because Elizabeth Keckley's story is not just history. It is, to me, the blueprint for the future. So, yeah.
The blueprint for the future.
It is the blueprint for the future.
Absolutely.
Her story, Frederick Douglass's story, Anna Marie's story, Booker T. Washington's story. It's right there. It's the blueprint is right there. Follow the blueprint.
Absolutely. Which segues, Ken, into the next question for you, which will be your last question. What steps can you give for us all, keeping in mind who your ancestors are, that continue to expound and expand that blueprint for the future?
So this is a question really about activism then, right? What can we all do today to look back at our history and be inspired by our history to be able to have, the energy and the passion and the commitment and the perseverance to press forward? There's a lot that we can do. At our organization, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, as I mentioned, we spend a lot of time in K through 12 schools because Frederick Douglass said it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I would add to that, and broken women. So as a part of our mission statement, we have building strong children. So that's what we do every day, because my ancestors' examples and their legacies, and Booker T. Washington, again, being the founder of Tuskegee Institute and the person that I consider bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement, because he understood, coming out of 400 years of slavery and oppression, that there were really two questions. Yes, there were people, including white abolitionists, that considered slavery morally wrong, but some of those same people did not consider Black people equal to white people. And so Booker T. Washington understood that. And so rather than demanding that people just change their racist ideology, he showed Black people how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles, develop strength of character, and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. So he really was that person that bridged the gap. He was also the founder of the National Negro Business League, which is still in existence today, the National Business League. He started National Health Week, which is still in existence today. He wrote more than 20 books. He is a consequential and influential figure in American history that is often misunderstood because of his approach of lifting yourself up. He said, if you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else. And so his message was about education, it was about service, it was about teaching formerly enslaved people how to be entrepreneurs, how to farm the land, how to make dresses, how to make bricks so that they could build their own school at Tuskegee. So today, I think we can really just stand on the shoulders of those legacies and do what we need to do. And first, I think that is to think critically about our condition. So when Frederick Bailey taught himself to read and write, he started to open up his mind and he started to ask questions like, why am I a slave? Why do you own me? And how come you know your birthday and I don't know my birthday? And he would turn to God and he would pray to God from deliverance from his chains and his bondage. And he would say, God, I don't understand how my master puts on a suit every Sunday and goes to church and in the word and the Bible and cherry pick scriptures finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property. At a very young age, he's already starting to make the distinction between what he would call the slave-holding Christianity of the land versus the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. And so he's questioning his country. He's questioning Christianity being used as a tool to oppress and to treat people inhumanely. And I'll say that history is not just about the past.
Mhm.
History is about the present and it's about the future. And so we have young people that we interact with today that will look at those lessons of history and they'll start to ask questions like, why is it because I'm born into a certain zip code, I have less access and opportunity to good education, good health care, economic opportunity versus someone else born into another zip code through no fault of their own?
Mhm.
So we want young people to start to think critically about our own conditions, their own conditions, and start to ask questions. And what you can do as far as activism is you can start at the local level and you can demand that your local politicians have legislation that advances DEI. And we're hearing a lot about that today and the pushback and the rollback on that. Again, that's nothing new. But we can demand that if they're not advancing our interests ahead first, then we vote them out of office. And we do that at the local level. We can do that at the state level. And then, of course, at the federal level. Use your talent, your passion, your creativity, and your intellect to work on those issues that you're most concerned about. And I bet if we opened up the mics to everybody, everybody would have something that is different that they're passionate about. I've had young people tell me they're passionate about saving the environment, passionate about eradicating homelessness and poverty, fighting for the rights of women and girls, whatever it is. Use in the same way that Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, Elizabeth Keckley, and all of those that came before us, they used that. They were passionate about something and they just started at something that could change and affect the world around them. And with that, you have a ripple effect throughout history. And I'll just say, close here really quickly. When Frederick Bailey was enslaved as a teenage boy in Baltimore, he met Anna Murray.
Mhm.
She was the first person in her family to be born free. She was also one of the first people to put the seed of thought in Frederick's mind that you're not meant to be a slave for life. I don't care what your master tells you. Had she not supported him by selling her personal belongings to help finance his escape, had she not put together or sewn the sailor's disguise that he would wear, who knows if he would have had the courage or the wherewithal to run away from slavery. And had that not happened, we would be a very different country sitting here today without the contributions of Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist, advisor to President Lincoln, statesman who was the first African American nominated for vice president of the United States, first African American U.S. Marshal, first African American recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, first African American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, and the first African American to have a statue dedicated in his honor in 1899 in Rochester, New York. We would be very different had Anna not planted that seed of thought in his mind. So that had a ripple effect throughout history. So what we are doing right here today in this Zoom conversation, what you'll be doing in your everyday life has a ripple effect in history. And it could be a positive if we're planting positive seeds of thoughts in our minds, or it can be negative if we're planting negative seeds of thoughts. And those negative seeds of thoughts ripple throughout history as well and will affect future generations. So use your passion, your talent, your creativity, dive into those issues that you find most important. And trust me, your voice can make a difference.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone. We can give a round of applause because that was outstanding. And we are going to now open up for questions. So, what I would like for everyone to do is rather than all the mics going open, type your question in the chat. And that way we'll be able to see the questions, and um, Kenneth and Carlene can respond as they see the questions come up. Carlene, are you able to see the chat
Yes.
questions as well?
Okay.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So everyone can begin if there are any questions.
Well, while we're waiting, I love me some Anna Marie.
That's
Anna
outstanding.
Marie was a force to be reckoned with. She was an entrepreneur. She owned her own laundry. Okay, Ken, you can jump in and correct me and whatever mistakes I make here, but she owned her own laundry business. And she was a very profitable business. And when she met Frederick, she knew that there was something special about him. And she was determined to see to it that he, uh, you know, became a free man. So she helped facilitate and financed his escape and organized it. Like Ken was saying, she fashioned a sailor's outfit, facilitated some paperwork from a different, you know, sailor for Frederick to have on hand in case they asked him for his papers. And he set sail and, landed safely in New York. And I think a week or so later, Anna met him and then they got married.
Yeah, he wrote a letter back for her to come join him, and so 2 weeks later,
Weeks later.
they got married and took on the name Frederick and Anna Johnson to make it harder
Yes.
for his enslaver to find out. And then, with the suggestion of conductors on the Underground Railroad, it was suggested that they go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, because he could likely find work there in the ship docks because he had acquired a skill as a ship caulker while he was enslaved working on the docks in Baltimore. So they get to New Bedford, Massachusetts 2 weeks later. And then it was suggested that he change his name, and Anna and Frederick loved the new name, so it was changed from Johnson to Douglass with two S's.
Yes. And she married him in a beautiful burgundy
Yeah.
wedding gown.
Mhm.
She arrived in New York with everything that they needed to start a home, from a bed to silverware to curtains to linens, pots and pans, and
Yeah.
dishes. You know,
Wow.
she was ready. This woman, she was a force to be reckoned with. I mean, they were the power couple, actually. I mean, think about it, right, Ken?
That took
Mhm.
a
They
lot
were
of trust
the
for her to say, I'm going to go and marry this enslaved person. She obviously, as you said, did see something really special in him, which we all know was there. He was brilliant, as was she.
And they
We
were
do have.
deeply, they
I'm
were
sorry.
deeply in love. They were deeply in love. Up
Yeah.
until death, they were very much in love with each other.
Um, we do have one question, and it is from Jocelyn Reed. And it is, how often are you able to speak with elementary, middle, high school students to share the message of figuring out their legacy and what impact they will have on the world? Never too young to begin thinking about it. So that can actually be answered by both of you.
I'm
Okay.
happy. Yeah.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I spend a lot of time, and if you can imagine, running a nonprofit organization, we're also working on building a museum dedicated to the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass and the Douglass family in Rochester, New York. We have a number of projects, including a partnership with Simon and Schuster, Frederick Douglass Books imprint, where we are publishing books and amplifying the voices of Black and Brown authors. So for those of you that listen to what you need to do or what you should be thinking about as an author, once you get to the point where you've got a book proposal, please reach out to us at frederickdouglassbooks.com or our website, fdfi.org. And so I have a lot of hats that I have to wear, but what I enjoy most about the work I do is the time that I get to spend in schools. And I try and do that as much as I can, either through Zoom presentations like this or when I'm in town traveling. I travel domestically and internationally because the Washington and Douglass legacies are not just here in the United States, but they're abroad too, in particular in Ireland and England and Scotland. There's a lot going on over there around education and these legacies. And so I love spending time with students. We also have another project called 1 Million Abolitionists. We've published a Douglass family edition of that first autobiography of Frederick Douglass's that we've been talking about, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And we're working to give away 1 million copies of that book to young people all over the world. To date, we've given away about 110,000 copies with the help of corporations sponsoring them, private foundational grants, individual donations. We're a long way away from the million, but with the help of people that get passionate and interested about this project and want to share Frederick Douglass's story, that truly coming of age story. One of the greatest gifts that Frederick Douglass gave to his country was his story. And we want to make sure that young people are connected to that. And also Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, his first autobiography in 1901. So any chance I can get. So if you want me to Zoom into your school, just reach out to us on our website. And if I'm in town, I'll come and visit.
That sounds great. Carlyn?
Same thing. I mean, not as grand of a scope as Ken's initiative is, but like for example, recently, just 2 weeks ago, I this was a K through 5 school, and we did a presentation honoring the legacy of Elizabeth Keckley. It was so fantastic. I had Adrice DeBarge, the daughter of El DeBarge, stand in and dress up as Elizabeth Keckley. And we did a presentation for the children, 120 of them. And at the end of that presentation, they got to participate in creating their own fashions, both boys and girls. And the challenge was if you were Elizabeth Keckley, if Elizabeth Keckley were alive today, what kind of fashions would she create? So it just kept the conversation going. And the whole time we were interacting with the children, we were also sharing some very important things about Elizabeth Keckley's craftsmanship, about her attention to detail and her razor sharp focus, and also the clients that she served, which were luminaries of the day. So, I think, those children went home talking about Elizabeth Keckley to their parents. And at the end, I actually have it on video in my Elizabeth Keckley Instagram. And the kids are like, at the count of 3, who are we celebrating today? And all the kids said, Elizabeth Keckley. And I think that was just so, I mean, it was just so heartwarming to see, 120 kids scream her name. And, it's a way of keeping her story alive. So yes, I do. I'm accessible. You just reach out on the website, elizabethkeckley.com. There's a section where you can contact us, and I'm happy to, talk to the kids, whether via Zoom or make an appearance. And if I'm in town, I'm happy to pay you a visit. I was at the Burwell school in North Carolina about a year ago, and we did the same thing. So, very much open to showing up. Oh, and also, the book is being adapted into a theatrical play. So in 2026, it's going to debut in Los Angeles. So that's also another way. In fact, one of the schools, the elementary schools asked me if there is a children's book version of Elizabeth Keckley's story, and if there's an opportunity to do a theatrical presentation that is, more designed and more geared for K-5 kids. So that's something that we're thinking about right now.
Oh, that is so exciting. That is so the play.
Yes, yeah.
That's wonderful. We do have a question from Shamika, and this is going to have to be our last question for time reasons. What is your solution to these book bans? How can we help get the word out about your work? So both of you.
Uh, you know, access it.
Mm.
What is the solution to it is to access it. I think, on your own accord, make it accessible to your children. Come up with a game plan as far as like from a personal level, come up with a game plan as far as like, acquiring these books and making sure that it is accessible to your children. Um, I know that here in Los Angeles there are bookstores that actually house these banned books. So I say to you to go to those bookstores. Most of like Malik Books, for example, in Culver City, owned by Malik Muhammad, is a lovely bookstore, and it is literally the watering hole of any possible book written by African American authors, stories surrounding the African American experience, the Black diaspora, authors, of color. I think those are the places that you need to frequent. Um, Not to take away from the big box bookstores, but those are the stores that you need to support. I know that there's something happening right now where, small businesses are starting to put together mobile banned books, mobile bookstores, and it travels around your town and they make an announcement that we're here. So I think being supportive, and, really, really just, um, you know, I don't want to say train your children, but teach your children
Mhm.
to access those books. I as a mother, see to it. I see to it. I mean, those are the best books to read. Those are the
So,
best books to read. So, and it doesn't just limit it to the stories of the Black experience, right? There are other banned books too that are equally important to our understanding. So I think, that's such a great question. I'm sure Ken has a better game plan to offer.
I wouldn't call it a better game plan, but I will piggyback off of what you said. And that's really what you said so eloquently. And that's, first of all, knowing what books are available. And, having a list of all of these books is really important because I know when I was younger and somebody said I couldn't read something, what was the first thing I wanted to do? I wanted to read it.
Right.
So, the banning of the books is certainly tragic because it's an erasure of history. But as long as we know that those books are what they are and that they're available, and they're easy to gain access to, with technology and the internet. But what we did, I heard that Frederick Douglass's narrative was banned in Oklahoma City Public Schools in the Edmond, I think it was the Edmond something school district. I can't recall right now. It was back in 2022. And so that was the motivation for us to start this project and publishing the Douglass Family edition of the narrative. Because if we figured if they're going to ban the book, we're going to put it into their hands anyway. We're going to find them in all of the places where young people congregate. And so we're going to churches, we're going to youth organizations, we're going to after school programs, we're going anywhere where, again, youth are gathering to make sure that they have this book. Because one thing that I know, I've lived in my skin my whole life, and I've had people of all ages and all races come up to me from a very young age, many times with tears in their eyes. And I never understood when I was a young kid what the emotional connection was that so many people had to my ancestors. And I never felt I was deserving of people wanting to hug me or pinch my cheeks or give me a kiss on the cheek. And it wasn't until we started doing this work at our organization when a woman came up to my mother after a presentation and said, I read Frederick Douglass's narrative when I was in the eighth grade. I read Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery when I was in college. And those books made me believe that I could do and be anything possible. And I am the person that I am today. I'm the leader that I am today because of the inspiration that I took away from their stories. And if I could tell them thank you in person, which of course I can't, you become the conduit to saying thank you. So can I give you a hug? And so that gave me a new perspective on the importance of these narratives and these stories and how they can inspire people. And so if people are going to try and ban books, it's not going to stop us. Again, that's happened in history before. Books have been burned. We just need to make sure that we let our students know, our children know, what these books are, their importance, and how they can find them, and just make sure that we're there to help them process this sometimes very difficult information that's in those books. So everything that we do is always age appropriate. We want to make sure that we're having those types of conversations.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's been incredible. I can't come up with all of the adjectives that I need right now to hear the history, to relate to the history, to be given our marching orders. Yes, thank you both. Thank you both very much. And we will absolutely stay in touch.
Definitely.
Well, thank you. Yeah,
Thank you
very
again.
much for having us. I look
Absolutely.
forward to continuing to be in touch and to figure out how we can continue to collaborate and make sure that we're carrying all of our history forward. Thank you.
Yes, we would love to visit Wilberforce together one day, right, Ken?
That's right. Yeah. Well, I'll be there this summer. So I know many of you will
Absolutely.
probably be off campus, but Hardy and I will be there with our Footsteps program 4 times this summer, as we've done for the past
That's
20 plus years. Yeah.
That is wonderful.
Thank you so much, Nanette, and to the whole
Thank you.
Wilberforce community for opening space to us. And Elizabeth is so happy.
Smiling down, all of our ancestors.
Smiling down, so happy.
Thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day.
Godspeed to you all. Have a great day. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.